142 men held out for a week before surrendering through the Red Cross. After repeated attacks, they were down to their last few grenades and bullets. The Egyptian officer who took over the fort believed they'd hidden their heavy weapons. The truth was, they had none. They were ferried across to Port Tewfik, where the survivors helped their wounded comrades ashore and into captivity. Among the Israeli reserves pouring down the road into Sinai on Monday the 8th, morale was still high. Their confidence in another easy victory was reinforced by their route through the Mitla Pass, still strewn with the wreckage of Egyptian defeats in 1956 and 67. But that mood was soon replaced by a much grimmer one, as the reality of the situation and the extent of their early losses became apparent. In those first few days in Sinai, only the Egyptians had cause to celebrate. The Sinai front was 125 miles from the main Israeli cities, but in the north there was no margin for error. The Golan Heights were barely 17 miles across, and from this plateau littered with volcanic rock, 4 routes led down across the Jordan into northern Israel. The Benot Yaakov Bridge bore the most important, leading from Kenetra and the area HQ at Kfar Nafak. A key Israeli observation point on Mount Hermon was known as the Eyes of Israel, as it overlooked the entire region. The Syrian plan was to cross the ceasefire line in one massive armoured assault, 2 columns forming a pincer to take Kfar Nafak and the bridge, while others struck out for minor routes. At 1400, synchronised with the Egyptian attack, a 50-minute artillery barrage began. It paved the way for the Syrian armour, which then swept past the border posts. They flowed in like water, one Israeli said. I never knew there were so many tanks in all the world. The Israelis had 180 tanks and 60 guns with which to hold the 40-mile front. It was the most desperate and heroic struggle of the war. A young lieutenant with a handful of tanks held up the main Syrian thrust for 20 hours at one point, ambushing, switching positions, and attacking again. Mobile artillery proved effective in slowing the advance too, and it was well employed. For the sole Israeli advantage was in knowing the ground. They'd practiced over it numerous times, measuring the ranges and the best angles of fire. But they hadn't anticipated odds of 5 to 1, or at times 11 to 1, and remorselessly, they were forced back. As in Sinai, the Israeli Air Force was thrown in to slow the advance. But even at low level, running the gauntlet of the SAM batteries proved costly. They lost 40 planes in the first afternoon. Infantry-operated SAM-7s and anti-aircraft guns joined the white contails of the SAM-6s, crisscrossing the sky to deadly effect. They adapted their tactics quickly, though, flying in low over Jordan to take the Syrians in the flank, avoiding many of the batteries. Wrecked Syrian vehicles lining the route bore witness to their effectiveness. And in places, the burnt and blackened ground showed that, like the Americans in Vietnam, they were using napalm. On Sunday, Israeli reserves in modified World War II Sherman tanks were deployed in the southern sector. They were opposing T-55s and even T-62s, the Russians' latest tank. Despite the 30-year technological gap, they destroyed greater numbers of Syrians. But at a cost. The 2 Israeli frontline brigades were virtually wiped out. They had, however, bought time for the citizen army. Mobilization had begun on Saturday. Many didn't wait for their code words. Seizing their equipment, they headed to either front, pressing lorries, cars and buses into service. One platoon even drove a milk float to their base in Sinai. Prime Minister Golda Meir expressed their mood.
This people, small as it is, surrounded as it is by enemies, has decided to live. And if we have to pay the price for living, we have to pay it. This is not a people that can give in.
Arriving piecemeal, the first reinforcements in the Golan were sent straight to the front. The situation was so desperate, there was no time for a coordinated response. In the south, the Syrians were now only 10 minutes tank drive from the Benot Yaakov bridge. By Monday morning, though, 36 hours into the war, the roads to the Golan were jammed with troops and equipment, in civilian as well as military lorries. Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war. Fully mobilized, the Israeli army began to turn the tide. Casualties had been heavy. They lost 250 men in the first 2 days in the Golan. It was not a price a small army could keep paying. And from Monday, limiting casualties became a priority. They now relied more heavily on artillery to dislodge the Syrians at long range. Yet Israel's part-time soldiers sounded confident.
I think that we already are going to finish the war. They got the nice kick down, and we hope to be at the weekend at home.
It would not prove that easy. Syrian resistance remained stubborn in retreat, despite their staggering losses. The advancing Israelis counted 500 tanks among the wrecks strewn across the heights. North of Quneitra, the Syrian columns had been constricted by minefields, and the crack Israeli 7th Armored Division hadn't wasted that advantage. They called the area the Valley of Tears. Abandoned among the wrecks were brand new Soviet Saga carriers, capable of firing 6 of these latest missiles. Israeli mechanized infantry cleared out pockets of resistance bypassed by the advancing armor. And by Wednesday the 10th, the Israeli Chief of Staff, General Elazar, could report on Israeli progress.
I am glad to tell you that we managed to push almost all of the Syrian forces to the ceasefire line.
But they were not stopping there.
We continue our counterattack. We shall continue it tomorrow, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
The Israelis had cleared most of the Golan, but they could not switch to Sinai until the Syrian threat was destroyed. So they attacked again in the northern sector, using Mount Hermon as cover for their left flank. They crossed the ceasefire line into Syria on the 11th, taking the shortest route towards Damascus. 2 days later, they were 15 miles beyond the ceasefire line, only 25 miles from Damascus itself. The Syrian reserves put up strong opposition from prepared defenses, and the Israelis had a hard slog all the way. With his capital threatened by Israeli artillery, President Assad appealed for an Egyptian attack in Sinai to relieve the pressure. Syrian MiGs joined the desperate defense, swooping on the columns on the left flank near Mount Hermon. But it was a rare appearance, for in the air, the Israelis were once more in control. The MiGs couldn't match them in aerial combat. And having destroyed the bulk of the Syrian missile system, they were now attacking targets all over Syria, disrupting the Soviet airlift of military supplies. At sea too, they were choking the supply route. In the first ever naval missile battle, they virtually wiped out the Syrian navy. And the Soviet Union was forced to move its own fleet to keep Syrian ports open. The Americans responded by reinforcing their Sixth Fleet, a thinly veiled warning against further Soviet involvement. The Arab world too came to Syria's aid.
The Jordanian forces entered Syria and have been heavily engaged in action throughout yesterday.
4,000 men of the Jordanian 40th Brigade fought alongside an Iraqi armoured division, attacking the southern flank. But coordination between them proved difficult. Both suffered heavily at the hands of the Israelis. They were the last major armoured battles on the Golan front. The Israeli advance continued along the Damascus road until it ran up against the main Syrian defence line around Sassa. Now within artillery range of southern Damascus, the Israelis were content to hold their ground, switching forces to the Sinai front. In Sinai, by the 13th of October, the Egyptians had 3 bridgeheads on the eastern bank, which they'd extended sideways along most of the canal, but which were only 10 miles deep. Yet the Egyptians were confident. They'd achieved most of their aims and were well dug in behind an anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile screen. All around them lay evidence of the damage they'd inflicted on the Israeli counterattacks. All they had to do was wait for the ceasefire according to plan. But Sadat had changed his mind. On his express orders, the 2 armoured divisions which formed the main reserve on the West Bank began crossing to the east, responding to appeals for action by President Assad. After the war, General Shazli claimed that for 2 days he had argued against this move, fearing that it left no protection on the West Bank. But finally, Sadat had given him a direct order, and he obeyed. The 2 fresh divisions were to lead a wide pincer movement to take Bir Gifgafa, forcing the Israelis to concentrate on their southern front. The Israelis were ready for them. It was what they'd hoped for. Tanks and infantry lay in wait, the latter now equipped with American TOW missiles. The further the Egyptians came beyond their anti-aircraft shield, the more damage they would suffer at the hands of the Israelis. At 6 a.m. on the 14th of October, the biggest tank battle since Kursk in World War II began. 2,000 tanks locked in combat along a 100-mile front. By nightfall, the Egyptians had lost a total of 264 tanks. The Israelis, only 10. Superior Israeli tactics account for part of that disparity, but another surprisingly simple reason was the suitability of the tanks to the desert terrain. When emerging from the hull-down position behind dunes, the main Israeli tank, the Centurion, could depress its barrel by 10 degrees, presenting a small target in order to fire. The lower-profile Soviet T-55 used by the Egyptians could only depress its barrel by 4 degrees and presented a much larger target